In November of 1812, in the frozen wastelands of Eastern Europe, the greatest military disaster in history was about to unfold. What had once been the most powerful army the world had ever seen was now a broken, starving mass of humanity, stumbling through the Russian winter toward what they hoped would be salvation. But ahead of them lay the Berezina River, and behind them, three converging Russian armies closing in like the jaws of a trap. This is the story of how Napoleon's Grande Armée, reduced from 600,000 men to a desperate remnant, faced annihilation at a river crossing that would become synonymous with catastrophe itself. The year 1812 had begun with such promise for the French emperor. Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the pinnacle of his power, master of an empire that stretched from Spain to the borders of Russia. His Grande Armée was the largest military force ever assembled, a polyglot collection of French, German, Polish, Italian, and Dutch soldiers united under the eagle standards of France. Nearly 600,000 men had crossed the Niemen River in June, marching east with dreams of conquest and glory. Moscow would fall, Tsar Alexander would capitulate, and Europe would bow completely to French dominance. But Russia had other plans. Instead of meeting Napoleon in decisive battle, the Russians retreated deeper into their vast homeland, burning crops and destroying supplies as they withdrew. The scorched earth strategy left the Grande Armée marching through a wasteland, struggling to feed itself as it advanced further from its supply bases. The summer of 1812 proved brutally hot and dry, and disease began to ravage the ranks long before the first shot was fired in anger. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow in September, his army was already shadow of its former self. The city was empty, abandoned by its inhabitants, and within days was it consumed by flames. The emperor waited in the burned shell of the Russian capital for 5 weeks, expecting Tsar Alexander to sue for peace. The negotiations never came. With winter approaching and his army dying by the thousands each day from disease and starvation, Napoleon made the fateful decision to retreat. What followed was a nightmare march across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The retreating army was harassed constantly by Cossack raids and partisan attacks. Supplies dwindled to nothing. Men fought over scraps of food and abandoned their equipment to lighten their loads. The cold began to bite as October turned to November. But the real enemy was not the weather. It was disease that claimed the vast majority of lives as typhoid, dysentery, and relapsing fever swept through the ranks like wildfire. Recent discoveries have shattered the long-held belief that winter was the primary killer of Napoleon's army. Genetic analysis of soldiers' remains has revealed that paratyphoid fever and relapsing fever, not typhus as previously thought, were the true decimators of the Grande Armée. These diseases thrived in the unsanitary conditions of the retreat, spread by the lice that infested every man's clothing. Soldiers wrote of the unbearable thirst, the putrid water from wells contaminated with corpses, and the constant torment of illness that brought them close to death. The numbers tell a horrific story. Of the central army of 265,000 men, Napoleon had lost 105,000 by late August, before the real fighting had even begun. 2 weeks later, disease and exposure had reduced the army to just 130,000 effectives. The retreat turned these losses catastrophic. By the time the remnants reached the Berezina River in late November, fewer than 50,000 soldiers remained under arms, with another 40,000 stragglers and camp followers stumbling behind them. As the broken army approached the river near the town of Borisov, Napoleon faced grave theist crisis of his military career. 3 Russian armies were converging on his position, like the points of a triangle. From the north came Field Marshal Wittgenstein with 30,000 men, tracking the French retreat with relentless determination. From the west, Admiral Chichagov advanced with 35,000 troops, moving to cut off Napoleon's escape route to Poland. And from the east, General Miloradovich pursued 32,000 soldiers with another, the hounds sin prey-apping at the heels of their. The Berezina River itself presented a formidable obstacle, 20 to 30 meters wide and filled with ampy and treacherous. Drifting ice, its banks were swell-broaching winter, had not yet frozen the waterway solid, leaving it impassable except by bridge. When French scouts reached Borisov on November 21st, they discovered their worst fears realized. Russian forces had captured the town and destroyed the bridge. The most obvious crossing point was gone, and the trap was closing. Napoleon's situation appeared hopeless. His army was outnumbered, exhausted, and trapped between a river they could not cross and enemies they could not defeat. The remnants of the once mighty Grande Armée huddled in the frozen forests, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air as they awaited what seemed like certain destruction. Many officers urged the emperor to abandon the army and escape alone, but Napoleon refused. He would find a way to save his men, or he would die with them. It was then that fortune smiled upon the French emperor one last time. A cavalry brigade scouting north of Borisov reported the discovery of a ford at the village of Studienka, 8 miles upstream. The water was shallower there, though still dangerous, and the banks were firmer. If a bridge could be built at Studienka, the army might yet escape the Russian trap. But building November a bridge in sub-zero temperatures, with limited materials and under enemy observation, seemed an impossible task. The man who would make the impossible possible was General Jean-Baptiste Eblé, commander of the army's engineers. Months earlier, during the advance into Russia, Napoleon had ordered Eblé to destroy his pontonniers' mobile forges to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Eblé had argued against the order, insisting that without the forges his men could not perform their duties. When Napoleon insisted, Eblé made a decision that would save the army. He disobeyed his emperor and kept the vital equipment hidden away. Now, at the Berezina, that act of insubordination would prove decisive. Eblé's engineers, mostly Dutch and Polish volunteers, began the Herculean task of bridge construction. Working in water that would kill a man in 30 minutes of exposure, these brave souls dismantled entire villages to gather the necessary timber and materials. Their tools were primitive, their conditions unimaginable, yet they labored with desperate determination as Russian artillery shells whistled overhead. The first challenge was deception. Napoleon knew that if the Russians discovered his true intentions at Studienka, they would concentrate their forces and make crossing impossible. An elaborate ruse was set in motion. French General Oudinot's corps made demonstrations near Borisov, while rumors were spread that Napoleon intended to repair the destroyed bridge or cross downstream. The deception worked brilliantly. Chichagov moved the bulk of his forces south, leaving only a small detachment near Studienka. As dawn broke on November 26th, the French discovered that their ruse had succeeded. The Russians had abandoned their positions on the western bank near Studienka. 40 French cavalry troopers splashed across the icy river, followed by 400 men in boats. They secure bank you just the far east their Mirik Eblé's engineers' completulous work. 2 bridges now spanned the Berezina, one for infantry and one for artillery and wagons. The crossing began immediately, but it would not be unopposed. The Russians had discovered the deception and were rushing reinforcements to contain the French breakout. What followed would be 3 days of the most desperate fighting imaginable, as the remnants of the Grande Armée battled for their very survival against overwhelming odds at the frozen river that would forever bear the name of disaster. The battle that erupted at the Berezina was unlike anything the veterans experienced. This of the Grande Armée was not the glory of Austerlitz or the triumph of Jena. This was survival in its rawest form, a desperate struggle between life out on a and death play stage of ice and blood. On the bank, Eastern Marshal Victor positioned his remaining troops like pieces on a chessboard of desperation. The plateau around Studienka formed a natural amphitheater, and Victor used every advantage the terrain offered. His Baden troops, the only units still maintaining any semblance of discipline, held the right flank with their backs to the river. Polish veterans, hardened by years of campaigning, anchored the left. Between them stood a motley collection of Saxon regiments and Berg conscripts, boys who had never seen battle now facing the elite of the Russian army. The sound that greeted the dawn of November 26th was not the usual stirring of an army camp, but the thunder of Russian artillery. Wittgenstein had discovered the French position and was bringing every gun he possessed to bear on the crossing site. Cannonballs whistled through the crisp morning air, smashing into the packed masses of soldiers and civilians waiting their turn to cross the precious bridges. The first Russian assault came like an avalanche of steel and fury. Columns of infantry in long grey coats advanced across the snow-covered fields, their bayonets glinting in the pale winter Sunday. Behind them came the cavalry, Cossacks on their hardy ponies and heavy dragoons on massive war horses, all eager to finish what the retreat had started. The clash, when it came, was titanic. French muskets cracked in disciplined volleys, while Russian artillery tore gaps in their lines. Men fell screaming into the snow, their blood steaming in the freezing air. But Victor's men held. These were not the demoralized stragglers who made up so much of the army now. These were the survivors, the hardest of the hard, men who had followed Napoleon from Egypt to the gates of Moscow and lived to tell the tale. They fought with the desperation of cornered wolves, knowing that behind them lay not just retreat but annihilation. The bridges themselves became scenes of unimaginable chaos. A steady stream of humanity flowed across the narrow wooden spans, soldiers mixed with camp followers, officers alongside common infantry, generals walking beside their horses, while common soldiers stumbled past carrying wounded comrades. The artillery bridge groaned under the weight of cannon and supply wagons, its timbers creaking ominously with each passing load. Eblé's engineers worked frantically to maintain the structures as Russian shells fell like deadly rain around them. These men, standing waist-deep in water that could kill them within minutes, represented the very pinnacle of military devotion. They hammered and sawed with numb fingers, replacing broken timbers, even fire spee, as enemy lintered the wood around them. Many collapsed from exhaustion and cold, their bodies floating away downstream like discarded dolls. The horror intensified when panic took hold among the civilians. Thousands of camp followers, wives and children of soldiers, merchants and servants who had followed the army into Russia, pressed desperately toward the bridges as Russian artillery found their range. When shells began falling into the packed masses, panic erupted like a disease. People trampled each other in their desperation to reach safety, crushing children underfoot and pushing the wounded into the icy waters. On the western bank, Marshal Oudinot faced his own nightmare. Admiral Chichagov had realized his mistake and was throwing everything he had against the French bridgehead. Wave after wave of Russian infantry crashed against the thin French line like ocean swells against a crumbling seawall. Oudinot himself fell wounded, a musket ball shattering his shoulder, but Marshal Ney immediately stepped forward to take command. Ney, the bravest of the brave, rallied the wavering troops with words and example. His red hair streaming from beneath his battered shako, he walked among the men under fire as calmly as if he were inspecting them on parade. When the Russians pressed too close, he personally led counterattacks with his sword drawn, his presence alone worth a battalion of reinforcements. The decisive moment came when General Doumerc's cuirassiers, the last intact cavalry unit in the army, charged the Russian flank at full gallop. These heavy horsemen in their steel breastplates represented the final remnant of Napoleon's once invincible cavalry arm. Their charge was magnificent and terrible, a thundering mass of men and horses that smashed into the Russian line like a battering ram. The impact was devastating. Russian infantry formations crumbled under the assault, and for a crucial hour, the pressure on the bridgehead was relieved. But the respite was temporary. As the second day dawned, Russian reinforcements continued to arrive, while French strength ebbed away like water through a sieve. The artillery duel grew more intense, with Russian guns positioned on the heights, overlooking the crossing site. Every shot that found its mark among the packed masses waiting to cross claimed dozens of victims. The bridges themselves began to show the strain. The infantry bridge sagged alarmingly under the constant traffic, while the artillery bridge developed an ominous crack in its central span. Eblé's engineers worked desperately to shore up the structures, but their numbers were dwindling rapidly. Of the 400 engineers who had begun the work, barely a quarter remained alive and functional. Napoleon himself crossed on the afternoon of the second day, his face grim as he surveyed the carnage around the bridgehead. The emperor who had once commanded the destiny of Europe now watched helplessly as his army dissolved before his eyes. Yet he remained, refusing all suggestions that he should hurry on to safety while there was still time. Of November 27th brought no. The night relief. Russian artillery continued to pound the crossing site by moonlight, the muzzle flashes lighting up the winter landscape like deadly humitid pale fireflies, the temperature turning the muddy approaches to the bridges into sheets of treacherous ice. Men slipped and fell, many too weak to rise again. their bodies soon covered by the trampling feet of those still struggling towards salvation. By the morning of the 28th, the situation had become critical. Victor's rearguard on the eastern bank was being pressed back step by step, their ammunition running low and their ranks thinning with each passing hour. On the western bank, Chichagov's renewed assaults were gaining ground, despite Ney's heroic resistance. The jaws of the trap were closing inexorably, and time was running out for the thousands still waiting to cross. The end was approaching with the inevitability of an avalanche, but the drama at the Berezina was far from over. The final act of this tragedy began on November 29th dawn, when General Eblé received the order he had been dreading. Napoleon commanded him to burn the bridges at 7 in the morning, abandoning all who had not yet crossed to their fate. But Eblé was not a man who could easily condemn thousands to death. He delayed the execution of that terrible order, his eyes scanning the masses of humanity still streaming toward the river. At 8:30, with Russian shells falling ever closer and the eastern bank swarming with enemy troops, Eblé could wait no longer. The torches were applied to the wooden spans that had meant salvation for so many and death for countless others. The flames leaped hungrily along the timber, consuming in minutes what had taken days of superhuman effort to create. The realization that their last chance was burning before their eyes triggered a final paroxysm of desperation among the stranded thousands. Men who had survived the march from Moscow, women who had followed their soldier husbands across half of Europe, children who had known nothing but the sound of marching feet and cannon fire, all surged forward in a last frantic attempt to reach the flames that marked their doom. Bodies pressed against bodies in a human tide that crushed the weak and trampled the fallen. Some threw themselves into the icy waters of the Berezina, preferring a quick death by drowning to the slower agony of capture or starvation. Others tried to leap across the burning bridges, their clothing catching fire as they fell screaming into the river below. The snow around the crossing site was no longer white but stained red with the blood of the desperate and the dying. On the western bank, those who had successfully crossed could only watch in horror as their comrades perished before their eyes. The lucky survivors, if they could be called that, numbered perhaps 60,000 souls from the original host of nearly 600,000 who had crossed the Niemen 6 months earlier. They were scarecrows in tattered uniforms, walking skeletons whose hollow eyes reflected the horrors they had witnessed. Among those left behind on the eastern bank were nearly 10,000 soldiers and an unknown number of civilians. Russian troops swept down upon them like wolves upon a flock of sheep. Some surrendered immediately, too exhausted to resist. Others tried to hide in the forests, only to freeze to death in the bitter nights that followed. A few hardy souls attempted to construct rafts from the debris of abandoned wag, but Theon's ice-choked river claimed most of these desperate ventures. The architect of this miraculous yet tragic crossing, General Eblé himself, did not live to see the end of the retreat. The superhuman exertions at the Berezina, standing for hours in freezing water directing his men, had broken his constitution beyond repair. Within days of the crossing, fever claimed him, and he died knowing that his disobedience to Napoleon's earlier orders had saved the remnants of the Grande Armée from complete annihilation. Of his 400 engineers, fewer than 40 survived the ordeal. These men had literally given their lives to build the bridges that allowed their comrades to escape. Many had worked until they collapsed from exhaustion and cold, their bodies swept away by the current as they fell. Their sacrifice would be remembered long after the political consequences of the campaign had faded into history. The strategic implications of the Berezina crossing rippled across Europe like stones thrown into a still pond. Napoleon had escaped the trap, but at a cost that would haunt him for the remainder of his reign. The Grande Armée, once the terror of European battlefields, was no more. In its place limped a collection of stragglers and invalids, barely recognizable as soldiers. The demographic catastrophe that befell France would echo through generations. At the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars, French men and women had been roughly equal in number. By the end of the Napoleonic conflicts, fewer than 9 men remained for every 10 women. This imbalance, combined with new inheritance laws that divided estates among all sons, rather than just the two that France's population growth, eldest, meant stagnated just as her rivals were experiencing demographic booms. The military lessons of the campaign were equally profound. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility lay shattered in the snows of Russia. European powers that had cowered before French might now saw that the emperor could be defeated, that his armies could be destroyed, that his empire was not eternal. The seeds of the coalition that would ultimately bring Napoleon down at Leipzig and Waterloo had been planted in the frozen soil around the Berezina bridges. But perhaps most importantly, the retreat had revealed the true nature of warfare in the modern age. This was no longer the cabinet wars of the 18th century, fought by small professional armies for limited objectives. This was total war, involving entire populations and consuming whole generations. The scale of suffering at the Berezina dwarfed anything previously seen in European warfare. Russian losses, though difficult to calculate precisely, were staggering in their own right. An estimated 150,000 Russian soldiers died from all causes during the campaign, with at least twice that number wounded. Civilian casualties were impossible to count, but certainly numbered in the hundreds of thousands as the war swept back and forth across their homeland. The combined total of military and civilian deaths likely exceeded 1 million souls. The word Berezina itself entered the French language as a synonym for disaster, a linguistic monument to the horror that unfolded on those frozen riverbanks. Generations of French schoolchildren would learn of the crossing not as a military maneuver, but as a cautionary tale about the price of imperial ambition. Yet even in disaster, there were elements of the miraculous. That any significant portion of Napoleon's army escaped at all was a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and determination in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The bridges built by Eblé's engineers under conditions that should have made construction impossible represented one of the greatest feats of military engineering in history. The crossing also demonstrated the complex nature of military leadership under extreme stress. Napoleon's decision to remain with his army rather than flee to safety showed the emperor at his most human, sharing the dangers faced by his men. The heroism of subordinate commanders like Victor, Ney, and Oudinot proved that leadership could emerge at every level when circumstances demanded it. As the survivors stumbled westward toward the Polish border, they left behind more than just their dead comrades. They left behind the dreams of universal empire that had driven France to war for 2 decades. The Grande Armée that had marched east with such confidence would never march again. In its place would come new armies, new generals, and new strategies adapted to a world where the old certainties no longer applied. The Berezina had claimed its victims not just in lives lost, but in elated illusions, shanned ambitions humbled. The ghosts of the Berezina would haunt Europe for decades to come, but in the immediate aftermath of the crossing, more pressing concerns demanded attention. The 60,000 survivors who had escaped across those burning bridges were not yet safe. They were still hundreds of miles from friendly territory, still pursued by Russian armies hungry for vengeance, still facing the full fury of a Russian winter that had barely begun to show its teeth. The retreat from the Berezina became a race against time and the elements. Each day brought fresh horrors as the temperature plummeted and the roads became rivers of ice. Men who had survived Moscow, who had endured the nightmare of the river crossing, now fell by the wayside in ever greater numbers. Their bodies lined the route like gruesome mile markers, frozen solid within hours of their deaths. Napoleon himself seemed transformed by the ordeal. The emperor who had once moved armies like chess pieces across the map of Europe now rode in silence, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. The weight of responsibility for the catastrophe pressed down upon him like a physical burden. Officers who approached him with reports found a man aged beyond his years, his legendary energy sapped by the magnitude of his failure. The discipline that had once made the Grande Armée the finest force in the military world had completely dissolved. Units collapsed, dissolved as men abandoned their colors to search for food or shelter. Officers found themselves commanding phantom regiments that existed only on paper. The chain of command that had stretched from the emperor down to the lowliest drummer boy was now broken beyond repair. Yet even in this dissolution, acts of extraordinary heroism continued to emerge. Marshal Ney, who had earned the nickname Bravest of the Brave through 20 years of warfare, now added new chapters to his legend. Time and again, he rallied the scattered rearguard, organizing desperate stands that bought precious hours for the main body to escape. His red hair became a beacon of hope for men who had lost faith in everything else. The frozen banks of the Berezina River had witnessed one of history's most devastating military disasters, yet also one of its most remarkable escapes. From the ashes of the Grande Armée's destruction emerged a legend that would echo through the centuries. The courage of Eblé's engineers, the heroism of Napoleon's marshals, and the determination of 60,000 survivors proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, the will to endure can triumph over impossible odds. The Berezina became more than just a river crossing. It became a testament to the price of ambition and the power of sacrifice.